A reading from the book of Sirach. Wrath and anger are hateful things, yet the sinner hugs them tight. The vengeful will suffer the Lord's vengeance, for he remembers their sins in detail. Forgive your neighbor's injustice, then when you pray, your own sins will be forgiven. Could anyone nourish anger against another and expect healing from the Lord? Could anyone refuse mercy to another like himself? Can he seek pardon for his own sins? If one who is but flesh cherishes wrath, who will forgive his sins? Remember your last days, set enmity aside. Remember death and decay and cease from sin. Think of the commandments. Hate not your neighbor. Remember the Most High's covenant and overlook faults. The word of the Lord.
Brothers and sisters, none of us lives for oneself. and no one dies for oneself. For if we live with the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So then, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this is why Christ died and came to life, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. The word of the Lord.
From the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Peter approached Jesus and asked him, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus answered, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That is why the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the accounting, a debtor was brought before him who owed him a huge amount. Since he had no way of paying it back, his master ordered him to be sold, along with his wife, his children, and all his property, in payment of the debt. At that, the servant fell down, did him homage, and said, Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full. Moved with compassion, the master of that servant let him go and forgave him the loan. When that servant had left, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount. He seized him and started to choke him, demanding, Pay back what you owe. Falling to his knees, his fellow servant begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he had the fellow servant put in prison until he paid back the debt. Now, when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply disturbed and went to their master and reported the whole affair. His master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant as I had pity on you? Then, in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother from your heart. The Gospel of the Lord.
Morning. Forgiveness is kind of a tricky thing. And just take a second and just see if you have a good definition for what forgiveness actually is. If somebody came to you and said, Hey, I'm excited to forgive so-and-so, but I don't really know what that means. What does it mean to forgive somebody? And it's sometimes hard to pinpoint. right? Because we can talk kind of around it, and I ask people this all the time to try to give me a definition of forgiveness, and it kind of becomes this kind of nebulous thing, and which is odd because it's such a foundational part of life, especially the Christian life, right? Jesus makes it very clear in this gospel, right, that forgiveness is not like an optional kind of nice thing to do if you find the time and the strength, right? Forgiveness is mandatory. It's not just an optional thing. This is required of every single person who's going to follow Christ, right? Forgiveness is key. And so it's important, I think, to figure out what it is we're doing when we forgive and to be able to talk about it in a way that makes sense. And in order to talk about what it is, we should also talk about what it is not, right? Because forgiveness is not just letting somebody off the hook. Forgiveness is not just saying, like, it's okay that you betrayed me or hurt me or did whatever it was. Forgiveness is not saying, like, it's... I don't care and it's unimportant. And forgiveness is not saying that I'm open to just being hurt by anybody anytime again. Right? That's not what forgiveness is. It's like, okay, well then what is it? And so I think the way I like to talk about forgiveness is in the exact same terms that our gospel uses, in terms of debts and credits. Because when somebody wounds us, whether it's big or small, right, they enter into our debt, right? They owe us something. And your heart is always keeping score. Always. Right? And we know exactly who owes. We know how much they owe. We know when they entered into the ledger. We know how much interest has accrued. Like our heart is keeping track of all of these things, whether you want it to or not. And so the tricky part about forgiveness is like, okay, I've got all these debts. What do I do with them? Because what we want to do, most of us, is we want to be kind of like that servant. Right? We want to find the person who owes us, and we want to get them by the neck, and we want to tell them that we're going to exact from them all of the payment that we are due. Right? I'm going to get every pound of flesh and ounce of blood out of you that I am owed, and you're going to know what it is to hurt the same way that I know. The problem is that doesn't actually work. Right? Even if that person does end up suffering, right? Compounding the suffering doesn't actually undo the thing that I'm struggling with. It doesn't actually pay back the debt that I'm owed. And what starts to happen is that as I hold on to that debt, the longer I hold it and the more I kind of just mull on it and stew on it and look at it, what starts to happen is I start to build up this sense of bitterness and resentment. And it starts to seep into all these other areas of my life that I never intended it to go. I didn't even want it to go. Right? But as I've been holding on to all of this unforgiveness, and I see the frustration as I try to get repaid over and over and over again, it doesn't seem to happen. Right? That bitterness and resentment just starts to spread. And so what do I do? What do I do when I notice that there are all these debts that aren't repaid? What do I do with them? Well, that's where forgiveness comes in, because forgiveness, what it is it's choosing to open the ledger, right? And choosing to look at all of the debtors and one by one decide, instead of collecting that debt from that person who can't pay it back, I'm going to then release the debt into the hands of the only person who can, right? Which is Jesus. Jesus is the only person that can make you whole. Jesus is the only person who can make you well. He's the only person who can bring you the actual healing that can undo the hurt. And as I go line by line and I say, I forgive so-and-so for this and this, I forgive that guy for that, and I forgive whoever for this, right? As I start going line by line and releasing these things into the hand of Jesus, what I start to understand and start to experience is that Jesus actually can fulfill both sides of the debt. Right? Jesus can fill my need to be made whole. Jesus can fulfill my need for that healing. Jesus can also then bring his mercy and compassion to this other person who needs to make reparation. And I'm not saying that Jesus is your bookie, but he kind of is, right? He kind of is, right? When in terms of debts and credits as it relates to the human heart, in terms of forgiveness, right? It has to pass through the hands of Christ if it's ever going to work. Because I don't know if you've tried this, but especially if somebody keeps racking up a lot of debt and you say like, oh, I'm going to forgive that guy for everything. That is very unsatisfying. And 9 times out of 10, that comes right back, right? And that bitterness and that resentment just keeps building. And so, brothers and sisters, what I think the Lord is inviting us to do is he's inviting us to open up the ledger, right? Which can be scary because all these things in red, all of these debts, what they are reminders of disappointments, and the reminders of trauma. They're reminders of painful memories and different things that most of the time we'd rather not look at. If we're honest, we'd rather just close that book up, put it on the shelf, and pretend like it doesn't exist. But again, that doesn't work, and that bitterness and that resentment starts to build. And so what the Lord is inviting us to do is to open up the ledger and figure out who it is that we're still holding on to that resentment, who it is that we're holding on to the debt that they owe to us, a debt that they cannot pay. And to say to Jesus, Lord, instead of expecting payment from this person, instead of demanding that this person pay back, like, Lord, I'm just going to release it into your hands. I'm going to release it into your hands because I know that you can bring me the satisfaction that I need. You can bring me that mercy that I need. You can bring me that healing, that love, that strength, that peace that I need. What starts to happen is that those strongholds of bitterness and resentment, they start to break down. And they start to become free. Because if you think about the two people in that story, right? The master and the servant. Well, sometimes we really want to be that servant and we want to be that vengeful kind of person. When you think about it more objectively, wouldn't you rather have a heart of such generosity and compassion that to be owed a huge amount and then just in the freedom to say, I forgive the whole thing? Doesn't a heart like that sound better than one of these hearts that is just craving revenge? Brothers and sisters, that's possible. A heart of generosity, a heart of compassion, a heart of love, a heart moved with mercy is possible. This is something you can actually have. But it requires going through that exercise. It's going to require that you open up the book and figure out who owes you and who you're still holding on to and what you're still holding on to. And that willingness to say, Lord, I'm done holding on to this debt. I'm done holding on to this, and I'm going to put it into your hands for you to deal with as you will. And again, this is not optional for the Christian life. Right? This is how it has to be. And Jesus makes himself kind of a requirement. I would imagine that forgiveness of that kind, forgiveness in this way, if you try to do it without Jesus, it's going to not just be hard, it's going to be pretty much impossible. Right? Because what you're essentially trying to do is you're trying to take this debt and you're just throwing it to the wind with no hope of being made whole, with no hope of being made well, and just deciding like, well, I guess this is just how it is now, which sounds terrible. Or trying to throw it into the wind and it just keeps boomeranging back, right? And it just keeps circling back over and over and over, and it just doesn't seem like I'm actually capable of letting it go. Which again seems even worse. Because that's what keeps us stuck. It's what keeps us trapped. It's what keeps us enslaved in that bitterness. It's what keeps us enslaved to that resentment. It's what keeps us bound to all of these things. So brothers and sisters, let's not be afraid that sometime, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next month, but at some point, to ask the Lord in honesty, Lord, who in my life do I need to forgive? Who in my life has wronged me and I'm still holding on to the ways that they've wronged me? Who I'm still holding on to the debt that they owe to me? Who is that? And as that person comes up, let's open up the ledger and let's forgive that person line by line, saying like, Lord, I forgive him for this and that and the other thing, and I'm just going to release it into your mercy. I'm going to release it into your heart of love. And I'm going to ask you to make both of us well. Right? That's what forgiveness actually is. Right? It's not letting them off the hook, and it's not saying that it doesn't matter. It's not saying that it's unimportant. It's not saying that it didn't hurt. But it's allowing the Lord who can make all things new, fulfill both sides of the debt that is owed.